funny how some things never change. I remember when neighbors used to wave from their porches, and the biggest disagreement in the community was over who made the best peon pie at the block party. Back then, you could trust that a man fishing by the water wasn't bothering anyone. He was just part of the rhythm of a peaceful day. That's how it was when we all moved into Oakwood Heights. Quiet, neighborly, the kind of place where time slowed down and people looked out for each other. So, when I pulled into my driveway and saw the police cruiser parked by the community pond, that familiar sinking feeling returned. In our quiet neighborhood, police visits almost always meant one thing: Karen Peton, our self-appointed queen of the HOA, had found another target for one of her power plays. As I jogged toward the pond, I could already hear her voice, a shrill, commanding bark that shattered the afternoon stillness. There, sitting on his usual bench with a fishing rod cast into the rippling water, was Walter Garrison. Walter, now 78, had lived here longer than anyone. He'd seen Oakwood Heights grow from farmland into family homes, watched generations come and go from that same bench. His hands, spotted and weathered with time, remained steady on the rod while chaos buzzed around him like a summer mosquito. Karen stood behind the officer, arms folded like some Wild West lawman. She wore her trademark blazer and slacks, the HOA president badge glinting in the sun like a sheriff's star. Her perfectly styled blonde bob bounced with each exaggerated gesture as she pointed and scolded. The young officer looked distinctly uncomfortable, shifting from foot to foot as he listened to her rant. But what happened next would cost our HOA control over $2 million worth of waterfront property. Let me back up. Walter Garrison moved to Oakwood Heights in 1992, back when this whole area was fields, and the pond wasn't a community feature, just a peaceful place to catch bluegill and catfish. His modest ranch home sat on 3 quiet acres, with the pond marking the eastern boundary. For more than 30 years, Walter had taken his morning walks with a thermos of coffee and a tackle box, settling by the water as the sun came up. Karen arrived only 2 years ago, buying a big, sterile McMansion at the top of Hillcrest Drive. It took her 6 months to land a seat on the HOA board and only a year to crown herself president. From the moment she took over, she set out to turn our sleepy, friendly neighborhood into what she called a premier residential community. First, she micromanaged everyone's mailboxes. Then came a list of approved paint colors, which conveniently included nothing but 6 shades of beige. She rolled out a set of landscaping demands that made the whole place feel more like a corporate park than a home. But her newest crusade? The pond. She declared it an HOA-managed amenity, requiring a $50 monthly permit for access. The morning everything changed, Walter had followed his usual routine, coffee in hand, tackle box in the other, walking down to the pond just as he had every Saturday for decades. He'd barely been there an hour when Karen came storming down the path in one of her power suits, barking orders like a general on parade. She declared, loudly and dramatically, that all access to the pond now required HOA approval. Walter didn't say much, just smiled and cast his line. That's when she lost it. My neighbor Janet, who had been walking her golden retriever, told me later that Karen had stood behind Walter, reading from the HOA bylaws like scripture. When he didn't respond, she told him she'd call the police. And then she did. By the time I reached the pond, a small crowd had gathered. Everyone knew Walter. More importantly, everyone knew Karen's antics, and we were all tired of them. Phones came out. People started recording. The officer tried to remain calm, asking Walter if he lived in the neighborhood. Walter pointed to his house, clearly visible beyond the trees. The officer then turned to Karen, who launched into a passionate explanation of property rights and regulations. She waved a manila folder she claimed contained proof that the HOA owned the pond and mentioned that it was worth $2 million. But then the officer asked Walter if he had any documents of his own. Walter, ever the patient old soul, reached into his tackle box and pulled out a battered envelope. Inside was a deed from 1992. Things got very quiet. The officer studied the deed, then stepped aside to make a phone call. Karen stood with a smug smirk, whispering to someone in the crowd. But after just a few minutes, the officer hung up and turned back toward us. His words turned Karen's face from confident to confused to absolutely horrified. The county clerk had confirmed that the pond and a 50-foot easement around it had never been legally transferred to the HOA. Due to a clerical error at incorporation, the land remained part of a public trust, with access rights tied specifically to Walter's deed. Not only was Walter allowed to fish there, he might be the only resident with formal legal access. The HOA had been charging fees and issuing fines for land they didn't even own. Karen tried to argue, but the crowd had already turned. Phones lit up with residents pulling up the HOA website. Questions came fast. Could they get refunds? Were the rules even enforceable? What about the threats Karen had sent? Within the hour, 2 county officials arrived. They reviewed the documents and confirmed everything. The HOA's claim was invalid. Worse, it opened a floodgate of legal and financial complications. One of the officials, Patricia Holloway, issued a cease and desist on the spot, freezing all HOA activity related to the pond. Karen was forced to make a public announcement right then and there, with Walter still sitting peacefully behind her. She apologized, announced that the pond access rules were revoked. It was like watching a balloon deflate. Some people cheered, others grabbed their fishing poles. That night, the HOA board held an emergency meeting. 3 members resigned immediately. The rest voted to bring in legal counsel. The damage was immense. The pond's removal from the HOA's asset list dropped property values and exposed the group to over $2 million in losses. Their insurer began investigating Karen for negligence. But there was more. Walter, it turned out, had warned Karen about all this before, months ago. He'd approached her after a board meeting with the same envelope, offered to explain the situation. She brushed him off, told him to get with the times. What she didn't know, what she never bothered to ask, was that Walter's family once owned the very land Oakwood Heights now sits on. His father sold it to developers in the 1980s, with the condition that the pond remain accessible and that the family retain permanent fishing rights. It was all on file. Local news picked up the story. The headline read, HOA president calls cops on elderly veteran, loses $2 million asset. Yes, Walter was a Vietnam veteran too. A detail Karen might have known had she ever spoken to him like a person instead of a policy violation. As the investigation widened, even more issues surfaced. Karen had been threatening residents with legal action over pond usage, despite having no authority. She'd collected over $15,000 in permit fees and convinced the board to take out a loan using the pond as collateral. That loan now looked a lot like fraud. The state attorney general launched a probe after several residents filed complaints. Her real estate license was put under review. At the next special meeting, over 200 residents packed the clubhouse. The tension was thick. When the financial report came out, not just the $2 million in asset losses but nearly $800,000 in projected legal liabilities, gasps filled the room. Karen tried to defend herself, but the room wasn't having it. People brought up her history of bullying, the $500 fine over mailbox paint, threats against a disabled veteran's wheelchair ramp. When the vote came to remove her from the board, it passed 212-3. The second vote, whether to hold her personally liable, passed 198-17. The board attorney explained she could face civil penalties of $300,000 or more. Someone shouted that the state investigation could lead to $50,000 in fines and possible jail time. Karen grabbed her papers, heels clicking against the floor, and fled the room in tears. Walter, he went back to fishing the next morning, same bench, same quiet, just as he always had. If stories like this hit close to home, or if you've ever dealt with a power-hungry HOA, a forgotten piece of property law, or a neighbor who just wouldn't back down, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more true neighborhood tales. Because sometimes, the biggest drama isn't on TV.